Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people are currently living and have been living for generations in this really dysfunctional relationship.
I'm reminded how Canadians have no idea who they are. They have no idea that they're produced from relationships with Indigenous people. And as a result, Canadians, when they are exposed to that, turn very angry.
You have people that are shocked when they hear about residential schools. They had no idea any of that was happening, you know. It never occurred to them that for them to be on Indigenous land, the land had to be taken from Indigenous people. That is a trademark of colonialism in Canada. That is a trademark of colonialism on the lands occupied by the United States.
I can't claim a connection to somewhere else. All I've got is this one. And this one, the connection that I've got here, the claim that I've got here, is violent. And so what does that leave me with? No option but to confront it.
Ce sont nous les étrangers qui sont venus ici. Il y avait des gens ici qui habitaient déjà les terres ici. Et c'est ça, c'est très important de comprendre ça. Parce que des fois, on a tendance à penser que ça fait 400 ans que ma famille est ici, mais on n'est pas les premiers peuples.
But Canadians, I think, generally are so fragile about the state, you can't criticize it. You start talking about genocide or colonialism or whatever, and first the reaction is, well, we're better than the US, so we shouldn't really, we don't need to talk about this because we're still better than the US. And so when Indigenous peoples talk about structural racism and things like that, it becomes very difficult to know what to do with those critiques if we don't have that history.
Thinking about my dinner table conversations, that's where it's been really hard, because I mean we live with that racial terror every day of our lives, and so it's hard to then think about that this is colonized land.
First, I want to acknowledge this tobacco that you offered to me, and I'm really grateful that you did that, because one of our teachings is that when we share and start to talk with one another, this tobacco will lead that conversation and the spirits that look after it. So whatever we're to discuss here, those doorways will be opened, and it's really this tobacco that will be leading that conversation. So I put trust in this tobacco to do that for whatever we're going to be speaking about here. How the nemaganataga nijo sek sagamakwa wase asamukdego atik dotem metega ning digitagui nigamingi tijumbig ego nishnabe kwenin oe miigwach keket oe sema kagi pejushkanamago angenin oe bungi oe chuito kage anetug oe ga kaishatuig oe mizanates chigan. I use my language first and foremost, and I do that for two reasons. One is so that spiritual world will recognize me, that spiritual realm will recognize me. And secondly, I do that for non-Anishinaabe peoples to let them know I'm sovereign, to let them know I'm Anishinaabe and I'm here.
So I always think of myself and who am I as an individual is very tied to, like the people that I come from and the land base that I come from. So when I think of introducing myself and acknowledging those relationships, I always think of my traditional introduction, which is Wapima Meosquan. I remember like when my mom was telling me when we were smaller, like when we introduce ourselves, within our ancestral language, we call forward like all the people that we come from. And so when I locate myself with my ancestral name and then my nation, it's also making myself accountable to all those relationships. So the relationships that I have as a citizen of that nation and as somebody belongs to our traditional territory, it calls all those forward. So then once I introduce myself, then I'm accountable and responsible for all the things that I do as somebody who belongs to this nation and to this territory.
I'm, first of all, an Indigenous person, so an Anishinaabe and an Anishinaabe man. And so my family and my community has endured legacies of, I guess, what you would call colonialism, but I call it just bad relationships, abusive physical cycles of relationships between this country and my family and my community that have embodied itself in a multitude of ways down to my everyday life, within my very relationship with my daughter, with my relationship with my colleagues, with the relationship with my family, and all of the parts that go into that. And my relationship with all Winnipeggers, all Manitobans, all Canadians. Every part of it is affected by that sort of sick and violent cycles of unhealthy relationships.
What is some evidence of ongoing colonialism in Canada that you've observed or experienced?
The fact that I'm speaking English right now, it's everything. Like, it's literally the prairie grasses themselves. Like, I often look over the landscape back home and I think this is not what my ancestors saw. Everything is different. The physical and even the water basins are different because the buffalo aren't there. The natural grasses that existed before with root systems that went down, 20 feet and fantastic carbon sequestering, they're gone, replaced by invasive species. The bird song that I hear is different. It bothers me that I can look at the North Saskatchewan, river valley and be like, this doesn't look anything like what my ancestors saw.
So in Canada, we have this idea of the North as a pristine wilderness. Even most Canadians don't ever go there, but they like to think of that. That's something we attached ourselves emotionally to as Canadians. But if you actually go out there and see what is happening in these communities, in these areas, it is this kind of cognitive dissonance of how could that be Canada? Why is it that all of these developments happen in remote Aboriginal communities? And I know I talked to one of the elders up in Fort Chipewyan in northern Alberta, and where they're on the Athabasca River, and all the effluent from the oil sands developments and many other industrial developments flows down the river to right past their community, and there's a very high cancer rate in their community. And he said, well, if the river flowed the other way, this wouldn't be happening. It wouldn't be allowed. If the river flowed into Edmonton, there's no way that would be allowed.
When Robert Bourassa in 1971 announced the project of the century in Quebec to dam up the rivers into James Bay, flood vast areas, generate hydroelectricity, sell it to the States. The Cree weren't told. The Cree that were going to be flooded weren't even told. They heard about it on the radio. I mean, you talk about racism. Here's the ultimate racism. It's one thing to say people don't matter. It's another thing to say people don't even friggin' exist. They're invisible. That's the way the Cree were handled. It's as if they weren't even there. I mean, how much more racist can a society get?
And then, of course, there's the Indian Act, which until the 1950s made our ceremonies illegal, made it illegal for us to hire a lawyer, for us to leave the reserve without the permission of the Indian agent, and made it illegal for us to organize. The Indian Act in Canada still controls virtually every decision and every aspect of life from birth to the grave. It is a continuous system of control over Indigenous peoples.
The most blatant form of ongoing colonialism in Canada right now is the forced removal of Indigenous children from our families and from our nations. The continued removal of children from Indigenous families is the most prominent example of colonialism. And now people are very comfortable with talking about the cultural genocide that occurred through the residential school system. What they're less comfortable in acknowledging is the continued removal of children through that very same process through the child welfare system. And then I link it in a way that Indigenous children are also a resource extracted by Canada, because the child welfare system is a multi-million-dollar industry in which many people are making lots of money off of the devastation and the fracturing of Indigenous families and communities.
Some evidence of ongoing colonization that I see and hear about are things connected to who gets imprisoned, who's in the jails, who's in the so-called justice system. There's so many deaths in prisons that don't get followed up on, don't have even the facade of a justice process.
We like to think of ourselves in Canada as a nation of immigrants, as a multicultural nation of immigrants. Canada is not a nation of immigrants, because when people immigrate, they come to a new land and they look at what's happening on that land, and they look at what's the society now that I'm coming into, and they find a way to operate within that and to respect that. Even though they may keep their own identity in certain ways, they may keep their own customs and their culture in certain ways, but the land that settlers came to, that is now occupied by the Canadian state, when that land was settled, a very different thing happened. The settlers came and they instituted their own laws, their own ways of being, their own legal systems, their own education systems, their own health systems, instead of respecting the laws and the governance of what was there. So it's not coming and fitting in a respectful way, it's coming and taking over. So that's why, some of the scholars will say Canada is not an immigrant nation, it's a settler colonial nation.
D'abord, ce qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que le colonialisme, c'est pas quelque chose juste du passé, c'est aussi quelque chose qui se passe maintenant. On vit ici au Canada dans un système colonial et il y a des personnes, ce sont les autochtones, qui sont visées par ce système dans une manière très violente, alors qu'il y en a d'autres, et ça c'est tous les non-autochtones, qui bénéficient de ce système colonial. Alors c'est vraiment très important pour moi de comprendre comment ce système marche et me situer dans ce système où je suis là.
I think of myself as, descendants, obviously, of some of the original settlers here, and sort of occupying space that was, never in any kind of way rightly ours to occupy it in the ways that it has been.
My family has been on Turtle Island for many generations, and I've recognized the depth of my family's involvement in the colonization of North America, and that it's generations of experience in colonization that have shaped me.
Mon ancêtre, je crois le premier, est arrivé à Québec en 1660 à peu près. Il s'est installé là-bas. 200 ans plus tard, la famille Lassaline s'est installée à Windsor.
Je viens de communauté blanche, alors je pense que j'ai une position de privilège par rapport au colonialisme dans le Canada. Et je viens d'une communauté qui a participé dans et a perpétué le colonialisme. En même temps, j'ai aussi une communauté minoritaire, alors je suis francophone dans l'Ouest canadien, dans une province qui n'a pas du tout respecté les droits des francophones, même si le français est une des langues officielles du Manitoba.
My name is Bill and Art. I'm here on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. I arrived in this land in 1991. So I was born here in December, and my mom tells me it was the first time that she had seen snow. Since then, I have had the opportunity to live in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, in Djibouti, and across, Somali territories, including Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And I think for me, my relationship to this land it's really complicated because I've had the opportunity to meet and learn from so many Indigenous folks in the different communities that I've been a part of, as well as Black communities and Afro-Indigenous folks, and I've been learning about the relationship with Blackness and decolonization. And some of the terms that I've heard that I think start to describe my relationship with the land are terms like forcibly displaced, thinking about global indigeneity, recognizing that there are Black folks on Turtle Island who are Indigenous to this land, but there are also folks that were brought here as part of the global slave trade. And so I know that in communities across Nova Scotia, language that's often been used and shared with me is language around arrivants. So I think that language is still something that I'm sort of figuring out, but I think that for me, that relationship is really underscored by a necessity for solidarity and a recognition of complicity in the settler colonial project, but not an identity as a settler, something different and something that I'm still working out how to name.
I remember a time when my son, I think he was in grade 3 or 4, we were driving in the truck actually, and he said, "Mom, am I Métis?" And I was kind of flabbergasted. Like, I didn't really know where this came from. I felt like, whoa, hold up, what's going on here? Trying to stay my eyes focused on the road ahead of me. And I said, well, no, like, we're not Métis. And he said, my teacher said, because I'm Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, that means I'm Métis. And he said, I tried to explain to my teacher that I'm not. My mom says we're Cree. And my teacher said, no, that's wrong. You're Métis because you're Aboriginal and you're non-Aboriginal. And this just infuriated me. And so we had a great discussion, you know, we're not Métis, we don't speak Michif, we're not from the Métis Nation in the terms that that's defined. Your grandfather's Cree, I'm a member of Fox Lake Cree Nation, you know, he speaks Cree, or the language that your ancestors before you spoke was Cree, and that means that you're Cree.
So the misconceptions are, especially lately, is if you can find a single drop of Indigenous ancestry anywhere, like, you know, 400 years ago, that's fine, then that makes you Métis. But that assumes that what makes us a people, it's like we're a 2-ingredient recipe. You know, as long as there's some First Nations and some mostly whites, very white supremacist definition, then that makes you a Métis. But if you have a German who marries a Korean, is their kid Portuguese? Like, we are a people with a culture, a specific history, found in a specific place with specific relationships to each other. And you don't get that through blood. Like, culture is learned, culture is shared, culture is practiced. It's a verb, it's an ongoing thing. And so I think people believe that we're sort of the category that's left over when you're not any of these other things. So discovering that you have Indigenous ancestry is interesting because I think for folks who don't know, it opens up sort of that hidden history that I was talking about before that's been very deliberately erased by Canada. All of a sudden you start to wonder, well, who was that person and what was the community that they were a part of, and how is it that they're in my family? You know, what were these connections and how did people get to know each other and what was going on at the time? I think it's an opportunity to learn more about the history here. That's most important. Learn the history first. If possible, find out specifically where that ancestor is from so that you're doing research in the right place. And then before you ever start claiming yourself to be Indigenous, go talk to those people. You know, you could find out that your relationships are stronger than you think, that they exist more recently. People might know things about your family that you had no idea about. Like there might be connections there. And maybe there's not. And maybe your place is just to be a person who acknowledges that they have Indigenous ancestry, but you're not an Indigenous person. And that's going to be a choice that folks have to make along the path of doing the work to form relationships.
Ce que je vois, c'est que y a quand même une manière où les franco-descendants blancs vont tourner vers une identité soi-disant autochtone ou métisse. Puis c'est une stratégie qui est disponible aux franco-descendants parce que on a une généalogie assez unique, dans le sens que on voit normalement, en moyenne, les franco-descendants vont avoir une ou deux ancêtres autochtones qui datent avant 1650. Ça ne nous rend pas autochtones aujourd'hui, mais il y en a entre nous qui voient une opportunité, une stratégie politique pour opposer les autochtones de nouveau.
Quelqu'un essaie de faire un land acknowledgement au début d'un genre de discours, et puis ils ont dit quelque chose comme je reconnais que je suis sur la terre des Métis avec qui les francophones ont toujours eu une bonne relation, une bonne amitié, et on espère que ça va continuer. Ça convient un problème parce que le but de reconnaître la terre où ce qu'on est, c'est de reconnaître qu'on a pris sans avoir la permission vraiment. Et de façon totalement illégitime.
La barrière principale, c'est toute la structure qui est organisée autour de l'idée que les franco-descendants sont bienveillants dans le passé et aussi aujourd'hui dans le présent envers les peuples autochtones. Donc, c'est comme un peu célébré dans nos sociétés, dans nos écoles, un peu partout. Et je vois, d'une manière, je vois pourquoi c'est célébré. Évidemment, c'est le fun, c'est bien quand on peut présenter notre propre rôle dans la société comme étant un rôle des bons, des gens qui sont vraiment sur le côté, dans ce cas ici, des peuples autochtones. Mais c'est juste pas vrai. Et pour moi, c'est trop facile. C'est trop facile. Parce que les mêmes gens vont pouvoir discuter des relations de pouvoir entre les anglophones et les francophones. Pas juste en discuter, mais ça va faire partie de leur vécu intime. Ces histoires-là d'oppression et de discrimination aux mains des Anglais ou des anglophones. Puis, alors pour moi, c'est toujours une contradiction très difficile.
Les sentiments que on s'est fait faire tort, par exemple, quand c'était illégal de lire en français dans les écoles au Manitoba, ça c'est quelque chose de complètement illégitime. Alors les gens qui sont qui se voient comme étant opprimés ou je sais pas quoi, à cause de ça, ils ont raison là, c'est un vrai problème. Mais ce que je dirais à ces gens-là, c'est oui, je comprends, je suis d'accord. Et même, je leur rappellerai aussi que beaucoup des écoles résidentielles étaient en français. Alors, c'était nous, les Canadiens français, qui les avons fait. C'était pas juste un oppresseur anglais.
French Canadians, we have to fight for everything. Everything, and it's constant. You have to fight for your language. You have to fight for your culture, to be able to live in that culture, to be able to speak that language. So, in a way, you can see where that feeling is, but it's not the same because it totally eclipses or wipes out the fact that France was a colonial nation and came over the same way that England did. That has to be acknowledged, and I'm not so sure that a lot of people acknowledge that particular part of their history, and that's important because we're all who are not Indigenous. We are the ones who are benefiting from the theft of the lands and the continuing levels of colonialism that exist through all our legal system, the children's aid, and everything. So it's important to realize that, well, no, you do have that, and you benefit from it. I benefit from it. We benefit from it.
Les Blancs franco-descendants ont une histoire de colonialisme qui est quand même assez violent et qui continue aujourd'hui, qui nous implore vraiment à avoir un regard critique sur notre propre positionnement dans ces rapports-là. Et pour moi, se positionner perpétuellement comme opprimé, ça fait partie d'une stratégie politique, une stratégie discursive qui nous permet d'évader nos responsabilités comme gens qui sont vraiment des gens qui sont des colonisateurs.
Pour moi, ça signifie que j'ai une responsabilité de faire quelque chose pour défaire ce que mes ancêtres ont fait et ce que ma communauté continue de faire. Ça veut dire que j'ai une responsabilité de parler dans ma communauté et essayer de changer ma communauté pour qu'on reconnaisse qu'est-ce qu'on a fait et qu'est-ce qu'on est encore en train de faire, puis qu'on ajuste différemment dans le futur, puis qu'on change notre société dans le futur pour être dans de meilleures relations avec les peuples autochtones.
As I sit here, I have a little card that's a status card, And when I need to access services, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's maybe to let people know who I am, there's this little card with 10 digits that tells that I'm a registered status Indian of Canada. And so even that has been imposed upon me. But I do know that that card doesn't tell me who I am. It's my creation stories that tell me who I am. It's the everyday stories that I have in my lifetime and my interactions and my relationships with people and the natural and spiritual world around me that really tell me, and it affirms who I am. That's the word. It really affirms who I am as an Anishinaabe.
You know, understanding law as a colonial instrument has helped explain to me why we've focused so clearly on these categories of people, you know, who's Aboriginal, who's not, who's First Nations, who's Indian, who's not. And that has created a lot of confusion even within my own family structure in terms of who gets to fit in these boxes that are created by law in a colonial system. So deconstructing that and saying, okay, what are original systems of governance and identification and of self-determination and of determining citizenship and citizenry in a particular grouping?
We always had family in our home, and I know in mainstream, like you often hear about like there's high rates of overcrowding within communities, but even today when I go back home, like at times there's about 21 people in my mom's home, and never once, like, you don't feel overcrowded according to government's definition of overcrowding. Never once did I ever feel impoverished. Never once did we ever use that word in communities. The First Nations population is statistically one of the at-risk populations for a number of different diseases, issues, like we're number one in most of them. But for me, that's not who I am. I'm not a number in their databases. I'm not a statistic. I'm part of a community. I'm a part of a really strong, resilient First Nations community. I come from a really strong family who has always loved and supported me.
I think as soon as you reach the age of 5 or 6, we're required, like we're supposed to get some kind of Western education. But for us, our education started even before we came here, before we were even conceived physically. So even our education, thoughts on education, our ways of education are very different. So when I came here, I had to learn something else, and I had to learn a different language to do my best to comprehend what was being taught to me.
When I was younger and talking about colonization and colonialism, my experience was being born and raised in Winnipeg was I only had the choice of going to English school or French immersion school. And so for me, I would have preferred the choice to perhaps even go to a school that at least taught Cree part of the time. I think that would have been a greater benefit to me rather than I went to a French immersion school.
I went to a French immersion school, for example, so we got sort of punished if we didn't speak French all the time. So it was more like there were like points, and you got points taken off and stuff like that. And then we were taught a certain kind of potted history that Quebec was great and the French Canadians were very nice and the British were horrible and this kind of thing. So there was kind of we were sort of taught a kind of colonial history, but it was that the French Canadians were colonized by the English Canadians. And that was kind of the main thing. And Indigenous peoples really weren't part of it.
And I remember saying this to a white settler scholar friend of mine who was my fellow graduate student at that time. And I said, oh my God, you know, I was really ashamed. And I was like, oh my God, I did not know that Canada was colonized. And I still remember the moment where we were standing, because she said, and I said, I didn't have my schooling in Canada. And she said, well, my schooling was in Canada and I didn't know that Canada was colonized. So I think that moment was so powerful, that moment of, you know, the colonial unknowing, the erasure of Indigenous peoples, the erasure of the ongoing white settler colonial violence that people like me needed to attend to. It changed my questions because, you know, as a racialized Muslim woman, all my work was focused on you know, racism against Muslims or Islamophobia in Canada. And it made me stop and say that, what does it mean for me to do this work in the context, in the very damaging, dangerous context of ongoing colonial violence?
Well, the first time I came here in Canada, I talked to other Filipinos within, of course, the Filipino community, and there has been a lot of stories about how horrible Indigenous peoples are, and I have to make sure that I keep myself safe because I can be robbed, I can be harmed. And it made me wonder about how come a lot of newcomers or people with immigrant backgrounds are so afraid of Indigenous peoples. So even on day first, when I did talk to my relatives, it's scary that how Indigenous peoples are being depicted in the picture is just a very, very sad scenario. And at that point, I felt like there was something wrong. I felt like there were some structures in place that indeed categorize people and stratify people.
I remember going to visit my grandmother who Cree was her first language. She spoke very little English, and I remember her trying to speak to me like in Cree, and I could answer her like her few questions immediately, very minimally, but as soon as she got to like another question I couldn't understand, she like she shook her head and she like walked away from me, and she was like and yeah, at the time it was kind of felt like, well, I don't know what she said. And but just the impact of colonialism that it's had, like even today, and continues.
In my family, we're about 3 or 4 generations removed from Cree fluency. And so the language carries so much knowledge, so much deep meaning that is so difficult to reattach with. And so we can take like language classes, for example, and figure out like the meaning of this word directly translates into this. But we know that there's so much deeper meaning, so much philosophy, so much like beautiful understandings that are not held within those direct translations.
And so if we're talking about the impacts of colonization, I would think for myself that there could be a level of grief or anger, sadness that could perhaps permeate someone if we were to see really the level of how our lives have been impacted.
Coming from a country, the Philippines, that was occupied by Spain for 333 years, by the Americans for more than 40 years, and the Japanese for around 3 years. And I feel like I have internalized the white privilege of how important it is to be white and how important it is to have those white qualities in terms of feeling excluded. looking down on oneself, I guess, thinking about feeling helpless or powerless are certainly the similar experiences that I could identify with Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Do you see any differences between your social location and your experience and what you imagine to be the experience of Indigenous people in Canada?
Absolutely. I always get into some heated arguments with other newcomers when I do my best to raise a little bit of a social awareness perspective when it comes to the history of Indigenous people that I'm privileged to know, going through school and having a lot of friends who have enlightened me in that process. I always think that there is a huge difference because even though we have gone through similar processes of colonialism, being a newcomer in Canada, I always have the option to go back to my country because we still have the land. And the Spaniards or the Americans or the Japanese did not take that land with them when they left the territories. And that is a very, very significant factor that makes our experience different from Indigenous people.
I think people from Indian or Caribbean background can be complicit by buying land, by having racist views against Indigenous people. Absolutely.
I think that a lot of us come in with that mentality that, you know, we've already joined hands with Indigenous people, so to say, because we are coming from other post colonies. But to then say that colonialism here is ongoing and that we might be, I mean, we are, but I'm saying for a lot of us, to come into an understanding that we might be complicit. It's hard because, like, I mean, we are racialized people here. There's intense racism against us. You know, the borders are xenophobic. There's Islamophobia. So how do we say to, you know, to our uncles and like aunties and parents and brothers and sisters and to ourselves that every day I have these colleagues who are extremely racist towards me, and yet I have these complicities that I need to think about.
I think it's really painful to know that we exist in a system and in a society that our friends and family and communities are complicit in, that exists to delegitimize us and our humanity. But I think that if we have the resources and the capacity and the space in our communities to be able to have those conversations, to hold that pain, and to have the resources to talk through a lot of that generational trauma, I think that we can finally start to get to a place to start to imagine and reimagine what our lives could look like working towards a decolonizing project.
I'm part of the land and the land is part of me. Everything in creation is above me. I was placed here last on creation, so I'm dependent on everything that was made before me. So for me, that includes the land. So I know I'm made up of that land.
We're all under intense pressure from industry and settler governments to cede land and to give our consent for the exploitation of our lands. But I can tell you with experience and conviction that to me, there is nothing more important than the land and my relationship to it.
It's very important to try to stop thinking of land as property. That is a very difficult one for many people, especially because it's sort of the Canadian dream, the American dream to, you know, have the house with the backyard and all the rest of it.
And I speak just from a perspective of Anishinaabe law. You're looking at relationship instead of individualism. And that instead of property or that idea of land or colonial acquisition, that you're looking at living a good life.
We need to transform the relationship we have to each other and to the land we share. As Winona LaDuke says, societies based on conquest cannot be sustained.
Treaty is an agreement to share the land. It's an agreement to live in peace together. It's an agreement of relationship. And if we're not honoring, those pillars of what treaty is, then we're not understanding or fulfilling the treaty.
And unfortunately, the treaties have been perhaps the most impacted by this violent and destructive cycle of relationships, because they've never been really embodied in the way in which they were intended to exist. So as a treaty person, I'm part of this relationship that's very broken and is very one-sided and very unbalanced. And what you'd hope is that people would begin to see all of these things that I just talked about, but that they would understand them to be opportunities and not deficits.
Looking at myself as a treaty relative, it's a real gift, it's a real privilege, and it provides me with a lot of really beautiful opportunities to relate in a different way and to live in a different way that will bring richness and joy and meaning to my life. By relating with Indigenous people, we also get to understand more about how to live on this land, what the land expects of us, how to enter into that network of gift relationships with the land.
I really do think that transformation is possible, and that outrage will turn into critical mass, will turn into, people picking up the responsibilities that all of us hold in Canada in order to change this colonial relationship and to undo these structures that we've been forced to live within.
Je crois qu'on doit parler de toutes ces injustices et on doit agir en conséquence, sachant que nous avons le pouvoir de changer ça. Pour moi, je ne veux pas être une des raisons pour lesquelles les situations sont comme ça. C'est pour ça que j'en parle. Parce que moi, je crois plutôt qu'il y a des façons qu'on peut vivre ensemble, mais ce n'est pas comme on le fait maintenant. Et je veux qu'on commence à bâtir, nous autres, quelque chose qui est beaucoup plus égal.
I think that it really can only happen when enough people in settler society have been convinced that their current way of life is contrary to the things that they have been taught to believe, an incredibly negative thing for themselves, for the land itself, that for Indigenous nations very obviously, but that it's intensely nihilistic, that it's intensely homogenizing, that it is contrary to human dignity, that it's contrary to their own self-interest and to the interests of their descendants and their children, to ultimately to continue to perpetuate this way of life, and that they want to seek change. They learn to want to live differently.
It needs a lot of people with determination and commitment. I mean, I think there are some situations where non-Indigenous people have to give up some things. It's not just win-win, it's not just mutual benefit. There's some things that have to benefit First Nations people, and we have to step back or give up or, I think that's part of it. But I think there are a lot of things that also are of benefit to both groups that I think a lot of the changes that need to happen benefit everybody, not just Indigenous people. You know, it's a hope for a more egalitarian, sharing, cooperative, collaborative future with better consultative processes.
Alors, quand on est dans des situations où, par exemple, nos droits linguistiques ne sont pas respectés, au Manitoba, par exemple, ou en Ontario, au lieu de dire « Oh mon Dieu, nous, les Canadiens français, on est tellement opprimés et c'est la faute des Anglais », puis finir là et pas penser à notre situation en tant que colons sur cette terre. Alors, quand ces choses-là arrivent, il faut qu'on y pense comme étant des occasions pour être en solidarité avec les Autochtones et qui vont faire ça beaucoup plus.
We need to restore Indigenous self-governance and sovereignty and support Indigenous futurisms. So those are like, I think it's really easy to say those things. It's really hard to get folks to understand what that looks like because it necessitates giving up power and it necessitates giving up so much that folk have made folks really comfortable, whether it's recognizing that, complicitness in supporting existing state structures needs to also end, and we need to not support our state structures, and that we need to push the folks that are in power right now for greater accountability, whether that's, implementing recommendations of countless reports around the livelihood of Indigenous people on these lands, and, the accountability to step down and support Indigenous sovereignty.
When the Indigenous population in this country finally, because we'll get there, gets to a point where they have the justice at all levels that they deserve and they can self-determine their futures and make them whatever it is they want to make them. The land that we share in this country is just, it's going to be a better experience for all of us. And I think people's relationships are going to be deeper and we're going to get to a place where lots and lots of non-Indigenous folks, whether they have European backgrounds or other kinds of backgrounds, are in good, solid relationship, with the First Peoples of this land. And that's going to be an amazing thing.
It's such a beautiful thing to be like the physical manifestation of the prayers of the people who went before you, because we're not supposed to be here. Everything worked against us, like taking the breaths that we're taking right now. And so for us to be here is such, in radical defiance of all those things. And so just to be joyous in this moment, to be joyous of our lives, to not take our lives for granted, and to use our lives and the energy, like the life energy that we have, to ensure the lives of the ones that will come after us.
Indigenous people are so invested in this relationship and they so want it to work. They want people to listen, they want people to understand, and ultimately they want people to work together on this project called Kanata or Manitowopo or Manitoba or Winnipeg. These are all projects and they're not over.
Part of undoing this really dysfunctional relationship that's been set up by colonization is actually, hearing each other's stories, sitting with one another, sitting face to face across the table and having tea, listening with an open heart and creating the spaces where our hearts can be open, and those defenses that we've learned to put around us can actually be placed down for a moment in time, right? And it's through that relationship building, I really think that there is hope and opportunity for things to shift.
I think what it boils down to is, knowing where we are, who we are, where we come from, knowing what our responsibilities are, and acting in a way that honors those gifts that we're given and tasks that we have, and choosing to live that good life.
Because a town is small doesn't mean we have to be depends on me. I will stand against all odds. Tell me what you wanna see. It's a long road, but we'll get there. To the lost souls, find your strength in the love we have together. Somewhere, somewhere, there's so much hope. Somewhere, somewhere, we will find a road. Just lead the way. Let's make this home. Uplift the brave hearts. You can echo my soul. You want the world to know. Echo my soul. You want the world to know. Let's make this home. Uplift the brave hearts. You can echo my soul. There's a story in my heart. Hear what I have to say. A flood that came in the dark, but our people never changed. We stayed together from the start. It only made us braver. We never gave into the fire. Show the world that faith works. It's a long road, but we'll get there. To the lost souls, find your strength in the love we have together. Somewhere, somewhere, there's so much hope. Somewhere, somewhere, we will find a road. Just lead the way. Let's make this home. Uplift the brave hearts. You can echo my soul. You want the world to know. Echo my soul. You want the world to know. Let's make this home. Uplift the brave hearts. You can echo my soul.
Don't believe in everything you hear. Listen, come with me and I will make it clear. I know there's something big happening. We wanna rise up from the hole we're standing in. It's time to get out and find strength in my native pride. I will represent my land and make it right. Live in a small place with big dreams. I will take any chance that you give me. So let me think deep. Don't wanna be forgotten. Wanna be a light while the devil plotting. I wanna see the truth. I'm just being honest. I wanna be the best, but I gotta keep it modest. I wanna see my culture.